Shabbat Shalom and Shana Tova. Rabbi Elazar fell ill. Rabbi Yochanan entered. He saw that he was lying in a dark room. Rabbi Yochanan exposed his arm, and light filled the entire house. He saw that Rabbi Elazar was crying, and he said to him, "Why are you crying? If you are weeping because you did not study as much Torah as you would have liked, we learned one who brings a substantial sacrifice and one who brings a meager sacrifice have equal merit, as long as he directs his heart toward heaven. If because you lack sustenance, not every person merits to eat off of 2 tables. If you are crying over your children who have died, this is the bone of my 10th son. If you are crying over your suffering and misfortune over the years, I too have suffered." Rabbi Elazar said, "I am not crying over my misfortune, but rather over this beauty that will decompose in the earth. I am crying because life is fleeting and all succumb to death." Rabbi Yochanan said to him, "Over this it is certainly appropriate to weep." Both cried. It is hard to fathom that it has been over 6 months since we entered into a global pandemic. It is hard to fathom that one day, mid-March, we each woke up to realize that our lives would forever be different, that our lives, our routines, everything that we had come to expect would be upended and different. And it's hard to fathom that not long after that fateful morning of realizing that our routine was no more, that we started learning about deaths. The deaths of our family members, friends, colleagues. We started hearing about death after death. And the numbers, truthfully, the situation became suffocating. It's hard to fathom the emotional, social, and physical toll that the past 6 months have taken on each of us, individually and collectively. Rabbi Yochanan entered the room and saw you were crying. Why are you crying? Are you crying because of the isolation and solitude that you endured for months on end? Are you crying for the lost holidays, the lost meals with your loved ones, the inability for the community, for our community, to stand shoulder to shoulder in the sanctuary, in this very sanctuary I'm in? Are you crying because of the financial implications these past 6 months have had and the uncertainty of your future financial health? Are you crying for the staggering numbers, the incomprehensible death toll that we learn about each night when we turn on the news? You respond to Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan responds to you. Over this, it is certainly appropriate to weep. You cry together. Rabbi Eliezer was excommunicated. He was exiled from the Beit Midrash, his house of study. He was told to separate from his students, his community, his world, to live elsewhere. As his death approached, his students finally came to visit him. At that moment, during that visit, Rabbi Eliezer raised his 2 arms and placed them on his heart, and he said, "Woe to you, my 2 arms, as they are like 2 Torah scrolls that are now being rolled up and will never be opened up again." He continued, "I have taught much Torah, and my students have taken away from me only like a brush from a tube of paint. I have taught so much Torah, and you, my students, have taken away a minute amount. Moreover, Rabbi Eliezer continued, I can teach 300 Jewish laws, a tremendous amount of Jewish law, with regard to a snow-white leprous mark. But no person has ever asked me about those laws. And I can teach 300 halachot, or maybe even 3,000 Jewish laws, with regard to the planting of cucumbers by sorcery. And no person has come to ask me anything about those laws, except for Akiva ben Yosef. And with that realization of all of that Torah that was never taught, that remains with him, Rabbi Eliezer's life came to an end. You've not been excommunicated, but it surely feels like that some days. You lived quarantined, more truthfully isolated, for months on end until the weather allowed you to go outside. Visits ended for a really long time, and for many of us, they have not yet fully resumed. Gatherings are relegated to the yard, and as such, your 2 arms are like 2 Torah scrolls rolled up, waiting to be opened again, fearful that they might not be opened for some time again. You cry, you grieve, but life does not end. You go forward. But how? How will you choose to go forward when this ends? Let's go back. Let's go back in time to the end of another storm. The flood that God unleashed on the world during the time of Noah. At the end of the storm, when the waters receded and it seemed like the storm had ended, Noah released the raven and the dove. In a beautiful midrash, the question is raised of what happened to the raven and the dove after the storm. Both had seen destruction. Both had seen the sorrow and the aftermath of that flood. So what became of them afterwards? The midrash answers, for the dove began rebuilding immediately. The dove spent her time rebirthing, caretaking, breeding a multitude of sons and daughters. And the raven? The raven has not yet rested since the time that Noah sent him from the ark. He could not rest because everywhere he looked, he saw the eyes and he heard the cries of those lost, as if it haunted him. The dove and the raven came out of the storm so profoundly different. For the dove, it was about rebuilding. It was about taking grief and sorrow and using it to rebuild her world and her family. And for the raven, he could not get past the horror that he saw. He was stuck in that moment, unable to return to Noah and unable to go forward. He was stuck mid-air, flying around from place to place with no direction forward. For each of us, this experience has impacted us in profound and individual ways. My experience is different from yours, and yours is different from mine. And even my experience is so profoundly different from my husband and my children's, and theirs so different from mine. We've each felt the past 6 months, and will continue to feel the coming months in our own isolated ways. But in truth, not one of us has not been impacted by this experience. Every single one of us has been impacted in some way, shape, or form. Like the raven and the dove, our flight forward will not follow the same path. But the storm will end, the waters will recede, and we will one day emerge safely from this pandemic. Yet when we leave the comforts of our homes, emerging onto the proverbial dry land, we each have a choice to make. Will you rebuild, or will you remain in flight? Will the horrors of the sounds of the sirens that we heard on TV from the city ring in our ears? Will the images from news reports stay in our minds? Will the sounds of Kaddish on Zoom reverberate in your soul, leaving you flying from place to place with no direction forward? Will you cry for the ephemeral nature of life and the Torah, your Torah, that has collected dust all these months being left unrolled? Or will you blow the dust off? Will you give your life meaning and purpose so that your legacy lasts longer than your physicality? Will you take the noise and images and use them to create a future of birthing and caretaking, of ensuring that your Torah is spread to everyone, even if they don't ask? Or will you stay mired in the moments of 2020? Today, as we begin the new year, it begs the question, what will you do when the waters recede? What will you do from this experience to go forward in strength and meaning? Because the only way to go is forward. Today, the world is born. Please God, this year, the world is healed, and we figure out how to fly forward out of this storm together. Shana Tova.